The fountain at Wren Park. Mira Alvarez had never believed in signs. She believed in spreadsheets, in double-checked footnotes, in the particular satisfaction of a well-organized bookshelf. So when she found the letter tucked between the pages of a second-hand copy of Great Expectations, her first instinct was to roll her eyes. The paper was thin and yellowed, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. It read, "If you are reading this, meet me at the fountain in Wren Park every Saturday at noon. I will be the one waiting. No name, no date." Just those two sentences, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand that made her think of fountain pens and rationed paper and a world she'd only read about in books like the one she was holding. She almost threw it away. Instead, she tucked it into her coat pocket and carried it home, where it sat on her kitchen table for 3 days, daring her to be sensible about it. She was not, in the end, sensible about it. Wren Park was the kind of place that existed in the gap between a city's ambitions, too small for a proper name on the tourist maps, too old to be paved over. The fountain at its center had been dry for longer than anyone could remember, its stone cherub missing 2 fingers and most of its nose, but pigeons still gathered on its rim like it owed them something. Mira arrived at 11:58 on a Saturday in October, feeling foolish in her red coat, telling herself she'd give it 10 minutes and then go get coffee and forget the whole thing. No one came. She sat on the cold stone bench across from the fountain and watched a woman throw a tennis ball for a dog that had clearly decided fetching was beneath its dignity. She watched an old man feed the pigeons from a paper bag, murmuring to them like old friends. She watched the church clock across the square tick past 12:15, then 12:30, and felt something in her chest deflate in a way that embarrassed her, because she hadn't even known she was hoping. This is what you get, she thought, for taking a letter from a dead stranger's book as an invitation. She was gathering her things to leave when a voice said, "Excuse me, this is going to sound strange, but did you find a letter in a book?" She looked up. A young man stood there, maybe her age, dark hair pushed back like he'd run his hands through it too many times, a paperback clutched in one fist like evidence. He held it up. She recognized the cover before she recognized the title. Great Expectations, a different copy. But the same letter, she'd have bet anything, sat folded inside it. "You too?" she said. His name was Theo Reyes. He worked restoring old furniture 2 streets over from the bookshop where she'd found her copy, a shop, they'd later discover, that had somehow ended up with an entire box of donated novels from the estate of a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had died the previous spring at the age of 91, with no children, and, as far as anyone could tell, no explanation for why dozens of second-hand paperbacks in her house all contained the same handwritten note. "Maybe she was lonely," Theo said, turning the letter over in his hands as if the back might explain more than the front. Maybe she just wanted to know that somewhere, some stranger was standing in this park because of something she wrote. "That's very romantic of you," Mira said. "For a man who fixes chair legs for a living." "I contain multitudes," Theo said, and she laughed before she meant to, which annoyed her, because she had come to the park irritated and prepared to be unimpressed by the entire enterprise, and here she was laughing at a stranger's joke about chair legs. They didn't exchange numbers that day. It felt somehow against the spirit of the thing, as if the letter had asked for patience, not efficiency. So they simply said, "Saturday then," and went their separate ways. And Mira spent the following week annoyed at herself for how many times she thought about a man she'd known for 11 minutes. He was there the next Saturday. She'd half convinced herself he wouldn't be. That 11 minutes and a shared literary coincidence didn't obligate anyone to anything. But he was sitting on the bench with 2 coffees, one of which he held out to her without asking what she wanted, and somehow got exactly right. "Lucky guess," he said when she asked how he knew she'd take it black with too much sugar. "That's not a compliment to my dental health." "I didn't say it was." They talked for 2 hours that day about Eleanor Vance, whose life they began unofficially to investigate. A widow, it turned out, who had worked 40 years as a schoolteacher and never remarried after her husband died young, in a car accident the year before Mira was born. About Theo's grandmother, who had taught him to restore furniture in a garage in Queens, telling him that everything broken deserved one honest attempt at repair before you called it garbage. About Mira's job at the university archive, cataloguing letters far less mysterious than the one that had brought them both to this bench, and how she'd started the job because she loved the idea that paper could outlive the people who wrote it. "That's what this is," Theo said, looking at the letter which he'd taken to carrying with him like a talisman. "Eleanor outliving herself? A little bit. Every Saturday." Mira didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she liked the idea of being outlived by something too. A sentence, a garden, a person who remembered you. She thought it might be too much, too soon, for a second cup of coffee. The Saturdays became a habit before either of them admitted it was a pattern. October gave way to November, the pigeons thinned out, the old man with the paper bag stopped coming, and still they met at the dry fountain at noon, rain or shine, moving eventually to a bench with a roof over it when the weather turned unkind. They found out more about Eleanor Vance along the way, not through any grand investigation, but through small threads that unspooled slowly. A former student of hers, now in her 60s, who remembered Mrs. Vance staying after school for any child who needed extra time, never seeming to mind the lateness of the hour. A neighbor who mentioned that every Saturday, without fail, for as long as anyone could remember, Eleanor had walked to Wren Park at noon and sat by the fountain for exactly 1 hour, alone, before walking home again. She was doing this herself, Mira said, when they learned this. Waiting, every week, for her husband maybe, or just for company. And instead of just sitting there alone forever, Theo said slowly, working it out as he spoke, she decided to send other people to keep her seat warm after she was gone. It was, they agreed, the strangest and kindest thing either of them had heard of a stranger doing. A woman had spent decades of Saturdays alone by a broken fountain, and rather than let that habit die with her, she'd scattered an invitation into 40 paperback novels and trusted the world to pass it along. "I don't think she was trying to matchmake," Mira said one Saturday in December, breath fogging in the cold. "I think she just didn't want the bench to be empty, whatever happened." "Well," Theo said, "it isn't. It would be simple to say that they fell in love because of a letter, but Mira came to think that wasn't quite true. The letter had only bought them the coincidence, the reason to sit still long enough week after week for something real to happen in the space between them. What grew there was ordinary, in the way that the truest things usually are. Shared coffee, bad jokes about chair legs, an argument in February about whether Eleanor's husband had died in spring or autumn that neither of them could resolve, and both secretly enjoyed having long walks after the hour was up that stretched into evenings neither of them planned. By March, they weren't leaving after the hour anymore. By May, Theo had fixed the drawer in Mira's kitchen table that had stuck for 2 years before she met him, sanding it down in his workshop on a Tuesday evening and returning it without being asked, the way his grandmother had taught him, one honest attempt at repair before anyone called it garbage. By the following October, 1 year, almost to the day, since Mira had first found a letter tucked into a stranger's discarded book, Theo asked her, sitting on the very same bench, whether she'd like to make the Saturday habit a permanent one, not the noon meeting, the rest of it, All of it. She said yes before he'd fully finished the sentence, which they later agreed was extremely on brand for both of them. Him restoring something old and trusting it to hold, her rushing toward a conclusion she'd already reached in her heart and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to. They were married 2 years later in the spring in a small ceremony that, over Mira's mother's mild objection about the smell of stagnant water, took place in Wren Park, beside the fountain, which the city had finally repaired that same year, so that for the first time in decades, water actually ran from the cherub's chipped hands. They never did find out anything more about Eleanor Vance than the fragments the neighborhood had offered them. No journal, no family member to interview, no explanation beyond the one they'd pieced together themselves. But Mira kept the original letter framed in the hallway of the house she and Theo eventually bought, 3 streets from the park, close enough to walk. And every Saturday, whatever else was happening in their lives, new jobs, a daughter born on a Tuesday in June who grew up believing the fountain story the way other children believe in fairy tales, the ordinary weather of a long marriage, its small droughts and its returns, they walked to Wren Park at noon and sat by the fountain for an hour, together, the way a woman named Eleanor once had, alone, for reasons that were entirely her own and that they had come, in their own way, to understand without ever being told. They never left a new letter in a library book, though they talked about it once, laughing over dinner. What would it even say? Theo asked. Mira thought about it for a long time before she answered. That waiting isn't wasted, she said finally. If you leave the door open for someone else to sit down. They didn't write it down. Some things, they decided, were better carried than printed, passed on the way warmth passes from one hand to the next without needing paper at all. But the bench stayed, and the fountain ran, and on Saturdays at noon it was very rarely empty. The end.